The thunder rolled across the Colorado territory like the voice of an angry god, shaking the very bones of the earth beneath Jacob Thornton's weathered boots. He pulled his black stallion to a halt on the ridge overlooking the Clearwater Valley, squinting through the driving rain that cut across his face like tiny daggers. Lightning split the sky, illuminating for one brilliant moment the devastation below. Sarah Mitchell's homestead lay in ruins. The barn that had stood proud against countless storms now sprawled broken across the muddy ground, its timbers scattered like the bones of some great beast. The small farmhouse still stood, but even from this distance, Jacob could see the damaged shutters torn away. Part of the roof caved in. The vegetable garden that Sarah had tended with such care now a muddy wasteland. Jacob had ridden this trail every few months for 3 years, ever since Thomas Mitchell had died of the fever, leaving his young widow to work the land alone. He'd never stopped, never offered help, never even acknowledged her wave from the porch. What business did a drifting cowhand have with a respectable widow woman? But tonight, watching the rain pour through the gaps in her broken roof, something stirred in his chest that he hadn't felt since he'd buried his own family back in Kansas. His horse shifted restlessly beneath him, eager to find shelter, but Jacob sat motionless in the saddle, water streaming from the brim of his hat. The storm was passing, but its damage was done. Come morning, Sarah Mitchell would face the impossible task of rebuilding everything she'd lost, and winter was only 2 months away. The decision came to him like the lightning itself, sudden, bright, and undeniable. He touched his heels to his horse's flanks and began the descent into the valley, toward a destiny he could never have imagined. Dawn broke clear and cold over the Clearwater Valley, painting the mountains in shades of gold and purple that would have taken Sarah's breath away on any other morning. Today, she barely noticed. She stood in the doorway of her damaged home, a steaming cup of coffee clutched in her hands, surveying the wreckage of her life with eyes red from tears and sleepless worry. The barn was completely destroyed. 3 years of careful saving, of selling eggs and vegetables in town, of mending and patching and making, do all of it scattered across 2 acres of mud. Her milk cow, Bessie, stood forlornly in what remained of the paddock, lowing softly, as if she too understood the gravity of their situation. The chickens had survived, thank the Lord, though their coop would need extensive repairs before the next storm. Sarah was 26 years old, but she felt ancient this morning. When Thomas had died, the town ladies had whispered that she should sell the homestead, move back east to live with relatives. She'd been too proud, too stubborn, too determined to prove that she could make a go of it alone. Now, staring at the ruins of her barn, that pride felt like foolishness. The sound of approaching hoofbeats made her look up. A lone rider was making his way up the muddy track that served as her driveway, leading a pack mule behind him. Sarah's hand instinctively went to the rifle by the door. A woman alone had to be careful, but something about the rider's slow, respectful approach eased her fear. As he drew closer, she recognized him. Jacob Thornton, the quiet cowboy who passed through every few months on his way to wherever cowboys went. He'd always tipped his hat politely but never stopped, never spoke. Sarah had wondered about him sometimes during the long, lonely evenings, but she'd never expected him to dismount at her gate, hat in hand, his dark eyes taking in the devastation with a mixture of sympathy and determination that made her heart skip strangely. "Ma'am," he said, his voice rough from disuse but gentle as morning rain. "I was wondering if you could use some help." Sarah stared at the stranger who wasn't quite a stranger, searching his weathered face for some sign of his intentions. Jacob Thornton was tall and lean, with the kind of quiet strength that came from years of hard living under an unforgiving sky. His clothes were worn but clean, his boots sturdy, his hands calloused from honest work. There was something in his dark eyes that spoke of old sorrows, but also of kindness carefully guarded. "I don't have money to pay for help," she said finally, lifting her chin with a pride that had carried her through 3 years of widowhood. "The storm took what little I had saved." Jacob shifted his hat in his hands, looking almost shy. "Wasn't thinking about money, ma'am. Just thinking about winter coming on, and how a woman and her livestock need shelter." He gestured toward the ruins of the barn. "I've got some experience with building. Worked construction back in Denver before I took to the trail." "Why?" The question slipped out before Sarah could stop it. "You don't know me. We've barely spoken 2 words to each other in 3 years." For a long moment, Jacob was silent, his gaze moving from her face to the broken barn and back again. When he spoke, his voice was so quiet she had to strain to hear it. Lost my own place once. Fire took everything, house, barn, my wife and baby girl sleeping inside. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Nobody offered to help then. Maybe that's reason enough. The simple honesty of it hit Sarah like a physical blow. She saw now the source of that old sorrow in his eyes, understood the careful walls he'd built around himself. Yet here he was, offering to tear down those walls for a stranger's sake. I can cook, she said suddenly. And I've got a spare room in the house if you need a place to sleep. It's not much, but it's more than enough, Jacob said, settling his hat back on his head with what might have been relief. If you'll have me, Mrs. Mitchell, I'll stay until your barn's rebuilt proper. As he began unloading tools from his pack mule, Sarah felt something shift inside her chest, like ice beginning to thaw after a long, hard winter. She didn't know it yet, but her life was about to change in ways that had nothing to do with barns or storms, and everything to do with the quiet man who'd chosen kindness over solitude. The days that followed fell into a rhythm as natural as breathing. Jacob rose before dawn, moving quietly through the house so as not to wake Sarah, and was already sorting through the salvageable timber by the time she brought him coffee and biscuits for breakfast. They worked side by side in companionable silence, speaking only when necessary, but Sarah found herself growing comfortable with his steady presence. Jacob was a man of few words, but his actions spoke volumes. He refused to let her lift the heavy beams alone, yet never made her feel weak or incapable. When she insisted on helping with the dangerous work on the roof, he simply positioned himself to catch her if she fell, never suggesting she couldn't handle it. He treated her like a partner, not a helpless woman, and Sarah felt a part of herself that had been dormant since Thomas's death beginning to awaken. The barn rose slowly but surely from its scattered bones. Jacob worked with the careful precision of a craftsman, checking every joint, every angle, building something that would stand against whatever storms might come. Sarah found herself watching him sometimes, mesmerized by the easy grace of his movements, the quiet competence in everything he did. In the evenings, after supper, they would sit on the porch, sharing the peaceful silence of the valley. Jacob would carve small figures from scraps of wood, animals mostly, each one perfect in its tiny detail, while Sarah mended clothes or shelled beans for the next day's dinner. Sometimes he would tell her stories of his travels, painting pictures with words of distant places and extraordinary people. She learned that he'd been everywhere from the California gold fields to the Montana cattle ranges, always moving, never staying long enough to call anywhere home. "Don't you ever get lonely?" she asked one evening, watching him put the finishing touches on a tiny wooden horse. Jacob's hands stilled for a moment. "Loneliness is safer than caring," he said finally. "Can't lose what you don't have." Sarah understood that philosophy. She'd lived by it herself for 3 years. But sitting there with him in the gathering dusk, listening to the gentle sounds of the valley settling into night, she wondered if safety was worth the price they'd both been paying. 3 weeks into the work, an unexpected visitor arrived that would test everything Jacob and Sarah had begun to build between them. Sarah was in the garden, pulling the last of the salvageable vegetables, when she heard the thunder of hoofbeats approaching fast. She straightened, shading her eyes against the afternoon sun, and felt her blood run cold. 6 riders crested the hill at a gallop, their war paint and feathers marking them as Cheyenne warriors. At their head rode a man Sarah recognized with a mixture of relief and apprehension, Chief Running Bear, who had traded peacefully with Thomas for years. But the grim set of his face spoke of trouble, and behind him rode warriors she didn't know, their eyes hard with anger and suspicion. Jacob appeared at her side so quickly and quietly that she jumped. His hand rested casually on his gun belt, but his posture was relaxed, non-threatening. "Friends of yours?" he asked quietly. "Some of them," Sarah replied, her mouth dry with fear. "The chief is peaceful, but I don't know about the others." The riders pulled up in a cloud of dust, their horses snorting and stamping. Running Bear dismounted with the fluid grace of a man born to the saddle, his weathered face grave as he approached. He spoke in careful English, his words chosen with the precision of a diplomat walking a tightrope. "Sarah Mitchell," he said, inclining his head respectfully. "We come seeking the white man who killed our young brave, Tall Wolf. Our scouts tracked him to this valley." Sarah's heart pounded. She felt Jacob tense beside her, but when she glanced at him, his face was calm, almost serene. "I don't know anything about that, Running Bear," she said carefully. "This is Jacob Thornton." He's been helping me rebuild my barn." One of the younger warriors spoke rapidly in Cheyenne, his voice harsh with anger. Running Bear listened, then turned back to Sarah, his dark eyes sad but determined. "Spotted Hawk says this man matches the description. Tall, dark hair, riding a black horse. He says Tall Wolf was found shot 3 days' ride north of here." The silence stretched like a bowstring ready to snap. Sarah felt the world tilting beneath her feet as she looked at Jacob, searching his face for some sign of innocence, some denial of the accusation. What she found there instead was a quiet acceptance that chilled her to the bone. Jacob stepped forward slowly, his hands visible and empty, his voice carrying the weight of absolute truth. "I shot a man 3 days north of here," he said simply. "Young Cheyenne brave, just like you say. But it wasn't murder." The warriors tensed, hands moving to weapons, but Running Bear held up a hand for silence. His eyes never left Jacob's face as he waited for the rest of the story. "I was camped by Miller's Creek," Jacob continued, his voice steady despite the rifles now pointed at his chest. "Heard a woman screaming. Found 2 white men holding down a young Cheyenne woman, fixing to have their way with her. The brave was trying to fight them off, but they'd beaten him near senseless." Sarah's hand went to her throat as the picture Jacob painted came into sharp focus. She could see it all too clearly, the kind of brutality that too often erupted when different worlds collided on the frontier. "I called for them to stop," Jacob went on. "They turned their guns on me instead." The brave grabbed one of their rifles during the confusion. "In the fighting that followed, he took a bullet meant for me. Died trying to protect that woman from those animals." Running Bear's expression had changed, the hardness in his eyes giving way to something like hope. He spoke rapidly in Cheyenne to one of his warriors, who nodded grimly and responded at length. The chief's weathered face grew thoughtful as he processed this new information. "The woman you speak of," Running Bear said carefully. "Was she hurt?" "Some," Jacob replied, "but she'll heal. I stayed with her until her people came. Old medicine woman named Winter Moon arrived with 6 warriors. They'll vouch for what I'm telling you." The young warrior called Spotted Hawk spoke again, his voice less angry now but still suspicious. Running Bear listened, then addressed Jacob with the gravity of a judge pronouncing sentence. "We will ride to Winter Moon's village," he declared. "If your words prove true, there will be peace between us. If they prove false." He left the threat unfinished, but his meaning was clear as mountain water. Sarah found her voice at last. "Chief Running Bear, Jacob has been working on my barn for 3 weeks, every day, from dawn to dusk. He's a good man." But even as she spoke the words, Sarah realized how little she truly knew about the quiet cowboy who'd appeared in her life like an answer to prayer. Now she had to face the possibility that her answer might be built on blood and lies. The 3 days that followed tested Sarah's faith in ways she'd never imagined. Jacob continued working on the barn with the same quiet dedication, but something had changed between them. The easy companionship they'd built was now shadowed by doubt and unspoken fears. Sarah found herself watching him, studying his face for signs of deception, trying to reconcile the gentle man who carved tiny wooden animals with someone capable of killing. On the morning of the 4th day, the sound of many horses approaching made them both look up from their work. Running Bear rode into the yard at the head of a larger party, and with him rode an elderly Cheyenne woman, whose presence commanded instant respect. Winter Moon's face was lined with years and wisdom, her dark eyes sharp as flint as they fixed on Jacob. Behind her rode a young Cheyenne woman, her face still bearing the fading marks of violence, but her head was held high, her bearing proud despite her ordeal. Sarah's heart ached as she recognized the haunted look in the girl's eyes, the same look she'd seen in her own mirror after Thomas's death, the look of someone who'd survived something that should have broken her. Winter Moon dismounted with the aid of 2 warriors, then walked slowly toward Jacob, her ancient bones creaking with each step. She stopped directly in front of him, tilting her head back to meet his eyes. For a long moment, they studied each other in silence, 2 souls taking measure of each other across the vast divide of culture and experience. "You are the one," Winter Moon said at last, her English accented but clear. "The one who fought for Little Dove when her own people could not protect her." Jacob nodded silently, his face grave with respect. The old woman reached into her medicine bag and withdrew something that made Sarah gasp. It was a necklace of extraordinary beauty, silver and turquoise worked together in intricate patterns that seemed to capture the very essence of sky and earth. Winter Moon held it up so that it caught the morning light, sending blue fire dancing across the ground between them. "This belonged to my grandmother's grandmother," she said solemnly. "It carries the blessing of 7 generations of medicine women. I give it now to the white man who has honor, who risked his life for a stranger's daughter." As she placed the necklace around Jacob's neck, Little Dove stepped forward. Her voice was soft but strong as she spoke in Cheyenne, her words carrying the weight of formal testimony. Winter Moon translated, her old voice ringing with pride. "She says you are brother to her people now. She says the spirits themselves guided your hand that day, made you their instrument of justice." The old woman's eyes fixed on Sarah, sharp with understanding. "She says also that a man who fights for the helpless is a man worth trusting with a woman's heart." That evening, after the Cheyenne had departed with gifts of fresh bread and vegetables from Sarah's garden, she and Jacob found themselves alone with a silence that felt different from all the others they'd shared. The barn was nearly complete, its strong frame silhouetted against the star-filled sky like a cathedral of hope. But for the first time since Jacob's arrival, neither of them seemed interested in discussing the work. They sat on the porch, as had become their custom. But tonight Sarah couldn't concentrate on her mending, and Jacob's carving knife lay idle in his lap. The silver and turquoise necklace gleamed softly against his shirt, a tangible reminder of the extraordinary man he'd proven himself to be. Sarah thought of Little Dove's words about trusting a man with her heart, and felt something flutter in her chest like a bird testing its wings. "The barn will be finished tomorrow," Jacob said finally, his voice carefully neutral. Sarah's heart clenched. "I suppose you'll be moving on then." "I suppose." But he made no move to get up, no gesture toward preparing for departure. Instead, he picked up his carving knife and the small piece of wood he'd been working on for days. Sarah had been curious about this particular project. Unlike his usual animal figures, this one seemed more complex, more personal. "What are you making?" she asked, leaning closer to see. Jacob's hands stilled. And for a moment, Sarah thought he wouldn't answer. Then, with the careful movements of a man handling something precious, he held up the carving for her to see. It was a tiny, perfect replica of her farmhouse, complete down to the climbing roses Thomas had planted beside the front door. Every detail was exact. Every line carved with loving precision. "Something to remember this place by," he said quietly. "Remember the best 3 weeks of my life since." He stopped, unable to finish. Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. The loneliness in his voice, the careful way he held himself apart even now, broke her heart. She thought of the long, empty years stretching ahead after he left, of winter evenings with no one to share the silence, of spring mornings with no one to watch the sunrise with. "Jacob," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "what if you didn't have to remember? What if you could just stay?" He looked at her then, really looked at her, and Sarah saw her own longing reflected in his dark eyes. But she also saw fear there, the deep terror of a man who'd lost everything once and couldn't bear to risk it again. "Sarah," he said, and the way he spoke her name was like a prayer and a goodbye all at once. Sarah moved closer to him on the porch steps, close enough to see the pulse beating in his throat, close enough to breathe in the scent of sawdust and sunshine that clung to his shirt. "I know you're scared," she said softly. "I'm scared too. But I've been thinking about what Winter Moon said, about trusting you with my heart. The truth is, Jacob, you already have it." The tiny wooden house slipped from his fingers, forgotten, as Jacob reached up to cup her face with hands that trembled slightly. "Sarah, I'm not good at staying. Every place I've tried to call home, I've lost. I don't want to bring that curse down on you." "Maybe it wasn't a curse," Sarah whispered, covering his hands with her own. "Maybe it was just the price of getting to this moment, to this place, to us." She leaned into his touch, feeling the calluses on his palm that spoke of honest work and quiet strength. "I lost Thomas, and I thought that was the end of everything good in my life. But maybe it was just the end of one chapter. Maybe you're the beginning of the next one." Jacob's resolve crumbled like a dam giving way to spring floods. He pulled her closer, burying his face in her hair, breathing in the sweet scent of lavender soap and sunshine. "I love you," he whispered, the words torn from somewhere deep in his chest. "God help me, Sarah. I love you more than I ever thought I could love anything again." "Then stay," she said simply. "Stay and help me live instead of just survive. Stay and let me love you back." When Jacob kissed her, it was with the desperate tenderness of a man who'd been wandering in the wilderness, and had finally found home. Sarah melted into him, feeling 3 years of loneliness and fear dissolve in the warmth of his embrace. Above them, the stars wheeled in their eternal dance, blessing this moment of two souls finding their way back to wholeness. But their happiness was not destined to be without one final test. Even as they held each other on the porch of the little farmhouse, riders were approaching through the darkness, men with hard faces and harder intentions, men who'd been following Jacob's trail for weeks with vengeance burning in their hearts. The riders came at dawn, 6 of them, their faces grim with purpose and something darker. Sarah woke to the sound of Jacob moving quietly through the house, checking his weapons with the calm efficiency of a man who'd faced such moments before. Through the window she could see the men positioning themselves around the farm, cutting off all escape routes. "Friends of yours?" Sarah asked, echoing his question from the day the Cheyenne had arrived. "The opposite," Jacob replied, his voice steady despite the circumstances. "The 2 men I killed at Miller's Creek, they had friends, bad friends." The leader of the group, a scarred man with cold blue eyes, called out from beyond the yard. "Jacob Thornton, you killed our partners, and now you're gonna pay for it. Come out alone, and the woman doesn't have to watch you die." Sarah felt ice form in her veins. She grabbed Jacob's arm as he moved toward the door. "There has to be another way." Jacob turned to her, and his eyes were full of a peace she didn't understand. Their island. He pulled the silver and turquoise necklace from around his neck and placed it gently in her hands. "Winter Moon said this carries the blessing of 7 generations. I'm thinking that's powerful medicine." Before Sarah could ask what he meant, Jacob stepped out onto the porch with his hands raised, apparently unarmed. The 6 gunmen relaxed slightly, thinking they had him helpless. But Jacob had learned something in his weeks of watching Sarah's quiet courage, her refusal to give up even when everything seemed lost. "You want me?" he called out, his voice carrying clearly across the yard. "But first, you should know what kind of men you're avenging." As Jacob told the story of what he'd witnessed at Miller's Creek, of the innocent woman brutalized and the young brave who'd died trying to save her, Sarah saw something she hadn't expected, doubt creeping into the faces of some of the riders. These were hard men, but they weren't all monsters. Some still had lines they wouldn't cross. The scarred leader wasn't one of them. "I don't care what they did," he snarled. "They were our boys." And his words were cut off by the thunder of approaching hoofbeats. Over the ridge poured more riders than Sarah could count, Cheyenne warriors led by Running Bear himself, their war cries splitting the morning air. But behind them came something even more unexpected. The sheriff from Cedar Ridge with a full posse, all of them armed and determined. In the confusion that followed, as the gunmen found themselves outnumbered 10 to 1, Jacob moved with lightning speed. By the time the dust settled, the leader was on the ground, Jacob's rifle at his throat, and the rest of his gang was surrounded by a sea of hostile faces. Sheriff Morrison dismounted, his badge glinting in the morning sun. "Jacob Thornton," he said formally, "the territorial court has reviewed the evidence in the Miller's Creek incident. You're hereby cleared of all charges. These men, however, are wanted for cattle rustling, bank robbery, and murder in 3 counties. As the gunmen were led away in chains, Running Bear approached Jacob with something like a smile creasing his weathered features. "The spirits watch over those who do right," he said simply. "Winter Moon saw this day in a vision. She sent us to make sure her prophecy came true." Jacob looked around at the faces surrounding him, Cheyenne warriors, white lawmen, and the woman who'd given him reason to believe in tomorrow again. The silver necklace seemed to pulse with warmth in Sarah's hands as she came to stand beside him, her love and pride shining like sunrise in her eyes. "I told you it was powerful medicine," Jacob said softly, pulling her close. The barn stood completed behind them, strong and straight and built to last, like the love they'd found in each other. It was a thing crafted from broken pieces, made beautiful by patience and faith, and the simple courage to begin again. As the Cheyenne and the posse prepared to leave, Sarah and Jacob stood together in the doorway of their home, watching the morning light paint the world in shades of gold and promise. Winter was still coming, but they would face it together, sheltered by more than wood and nails, sheltered by love, by community, by the unbreakable bonds forged when good people stand together against the darkness. The storm had taken Sarah's old barn, but it had given her something infinitely more precious in return. In the distance, a meadowlark sang its sweet song to the rising sun, and the future stretched ahead of them like an endless prairie, full of possibility and hope.